Hi, Glenn.
Hello,
Pat here.
Pat. Welcome to the board.
Thank you. Looking forward to it.
Hello. Good morning to you. Good morning.
Morning, Glenn.
Morning.
Good morning, Member Rennie. So this is Elaine from the board office. We have not heard from Darcy Paul. So in case he's not signed on, we will be asking you to vote on his behalf.
I think that was to you, Rob.
He's on mute. Member Constantine, can we do a quick mic check, please?
Sure. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning. Chair Hendricks, this is Elaine. I believe we have a quorum now, so we can go ahead and get started whenever you're ready.
Okay, awesome. Good morning. Our special board meeting is now called to order at 9 o'clock. I'd like to welcome newly appointed board member Pat Burt from the Northwest City Group. Pat is a council member from the city of Palo Alto, and I believe I believe that Elaine will now administer the oath of office.
Hi, good morning. Please raise your right hand, Member Burt. I state your name.
I, Patrick Burt,
Do solemnly swear
do solemnly swear
that I will support and defend
that I will support and defend
the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of the State of California
the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of the State of California
against all enemies, foreign and domestic,
against all enemies, foreign and domestic,
that I will bear true faith and allegiance
that I will bear true faith and allegiance
to the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of the State of California,
to the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of the State of California,
that I take this obligation freely
that I take this obligation freely
without any mental reservation or purpose of evasion,
without any mental reservation or purpose of evasion,
and that I will well and faithfully discharge
and that I will well and faithfully discharge
the duties upon which I'm about to enter.
the duties upon which I'm about to enter.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, welcome aboard, Pat. We're going to jump right in though, but thanks for joining the team. All right, so now we can have a roll call. So if everyone would unmute their mics, and Talia, please.
Yes. Abacoba, Blankley, Burt,
Here.
Carrasco,
Here.
Chavez,
Here.
Constantine,
Present.
Davis,
Here.
Gilmore,
Here.
Jimenez, Lee, Liccardo,
Present.
Montano,
Present.
Hall,
Here.
Perales, Rennie,
Here.
Semidion,
Here.
Vice Chair Jones,
Present.
Chairperson Hendricks.
Attending.
You have a quorum.
Okay, great. Thank you. Before we move on to the next item on the agenda, I'd like to note some housekeeping items for today. We've got a lot to get done. We have a lot of important items to discuss, and I want to be respectful of my colleagues' time and the public's time. To make sure that we go through all the items that we have for today, we will be doing the following. We will go through the open session items for the special meeting from now until 9:15. At 9:15, I will entertain a motion to continue the special meeting at 11:30. Continuing the special meeting at 11:30 will give us a little over 2 hours to discuss the workshop items. During the workshop, which will promptly begin at 9:15, I would like to ask my colleagues to let staff finish their presentation before asking questions. After the staff presentation, we will go to public comment and then back to the board for discussion. For members of the public with us today, please wait until we get to your item before raising your hand. We will have a hard stop for the workshop at 11:30. I just want to let everybody know right now we're stopping at 11:30. At that time, we will continue the special meeting and the board will go into closed session. We will reconvene to open session before noon so that we can do the closed session report. And with this plan, we should be able to adjourn today's session at noon. And I hope that plan is satisfactory to everyone. So with that, our first item on the agenda today is item 2.1, which is to ratify the appointment of General Counsel Evelyn Tran as acting General Manager and CEO for the Santa Clara Valley Transportation Authority, in addition to maintaining her current role as the General Counsel. I think we're all aware that Nuria has resigned to take a position at the DOT, and this is an acting role until we can complete a job search, which we will be discussing next. In addition, we want to authorize the Chief Administrative Officer to take all necessary actions to execute a contract with an executive search firm to recruit candidates for the position of General Manager / CEO. Sylvester Fidal, Chief Administrative Officer, is here to answer any questions. But before we go through the board questions, I would like to ask and see if there are any public comments on this item. Members of the public wishing to speak should raise their hands now or press *9. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to look and see if there are any public comment. I've opened the public hearing. I'm looking to see if there are any public comments. Talia, could you please let our speakers in?
Yes. Looks like we have two speakers. Blair, followed by Eugene. Blair, you may begin speaking when ready.
Hi, I didn't have time to write a public comment letter on this subject. Thank you for Chairman Fernandez's service, or Chairperson Fernandez's service as VTO head, as VTA head. She did some incredible work how to balance the budget in this time of COVID-19. And I think we're all respecting the patience that I hope all of us can be respecting about how to address the needs of transit operation services and its budget. And she's navigated very well, I mean, incredibly well, how to do all of that. And I hope our local cities can respect and appreciate what she's trying to work on and develop for transit services and operations. And to conclude, thanks for her service.
Okay, thank you. Our next speaker, please.
Yes. Eugene, you may begin speaking when ready.
Good morning, board members. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
This is Eugene Bradley, founder and CEO of the Silicon Valley Transit Users. I wanted to congratulate Ms. Fernandez on her service at VTA. She was clearly the best general manager that I've ever worked with. She was clearly just a step up from previous general managers in terms of public transit knowledge, and VTA would be very hard pressed to just find a proper replacement for her. Just overall, good luck to Ms. Fernandez, and also good luck to VTA in trying to find a successor. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think that's all the public speakers I see. So I'm going to close the public session and I'm going to come back to my board colleagues if there are any comments or questions. Any comments or questions? Is there a will of my colleagues?
Motion to approve.
Hey, Glenn?
Sam, did you have a question first before the motion?
Yes, I did. And this is specifically on the appointment. Is that correct? The motion?
Yes.
Yeah, just a quick question for Evelyn. And first, a very big thank you to Evelyn for her willingness to serve in this role in a very, very difficult time to lead a transit agency. I appreciate her willingness to step up. Have you clearly identified, Evelyn, who's going to be really handling day-to-day in the general counsel's office? I think that's important, recognizing you're going to need to delegate an awful lot taking on this additional role.
Yes, I have. My Deputy General Counsel, Carlos Oriana, who's actually on the panel this morning.
Okay, wonderful. Just want to, for all of us to be aware who we should be going to at different times. Thank you very much, Evan.
Okay, thank you. Not seeing, are there any other comments or questions, or is it back to Vice Mayor Jones?
So motion to approve.
Okay.
Second, Chavez.
Okay, great. So we have a motion and a second. Sam, is your hand just still up from before?
Yes, I'm sorry, it
Okay.
was not lowered.
No problem. Seeing no other comments or questions, could we please have a voice vote?
Burt,
Yes.
Carrasco,
Yes.
Chavez,
Yes.
Constantine,
Aye.
Jimenez,
Aye.
Ricardo,
Aye.
Montano,
Aye.
Paul,
Aye.
Peralez. Okay, since member Peralez is not here, I'm going to call on alternate board member Davis.
Aye.
Thank you. Simidian. Thank you. Jones,
Aye.
Hendricks.
Yes. Thank
Motion
you.
passed unanimously.
Thank you, and congratulations to Evelyn Tran and thank her for stepping into this role while we look for a new GM. Moving on to item 2.2, information on the VTA General Manager CEO recruitment process. Sylvester Fadal, Chief Administrative Officer, is going to provide a brief report on this. Sylvester, it's yours.
Great. Sorry, I had to unmute myself. Thanks, Mr. Chair, and good morning, everyone. I wanted to walk the team through the process we will follow in the recruitment of the new GM, CEO for VTA. As we all know, Nuria resigned on January 19th, and the intent is to expedite this recruitment process. All strategies pertaining to the recruitment will be followed consistent with the Uniform Selection Guidelines for an at-will executive CEO. The average timeline for the recruitment of a general manager spans 5 to 6 months. Though we're hoping to expedite our process, it's important to recognize that this position is highly competitive, and typically the timeline is driven by the competition in the market. And I want to briefly share with members of the board what we're competing against at this point. As of today, there are over 16 general manager positions open nationwide. 9 of those are large transit agencies seeking general manager CEO. A couple of them are in the Bay Area. We have VTA and Caltrain. You have DOT, which is Dallas Area Rapid Transit. We have TriMet in Portland, Oregon, TransLink in Vancouver, Canada, Honolulu, PS Transit in Washington, Miami-Dade in Florida, and Connect Transit in Bloomington, Illinois. So this is going to be a very tough recruitment process. It's going to be highly competitive. And what's even more interesting is 8 of those agencies I just read to you have similar salary structures like the VTA. The compensation range is pretty much similar to what we have here. And right beside Honolulu, by the way, Silicon Valley is perhaps one of the most expensive areas to reside. So I just wanted to get that out there so we know the battle ahead of us. Although we're seeking to expedite, I just want the board to be aware it's going to be a very competitive process. Next slide, please. So as we move along this process, we'll be reporting to the board periodically and providing updates. But the first step today is the selection board search committee. This is typically a composition of 4 board members made up of the board chair, the vice chair, and the board chair gets to appoint a couple of board members to sit on the search committee, making a total of 4. The search committee is the team that typically works very closely with my team and the executive search firm, going back and forth on shortlisting candidates, taking questions from the board, feeding those questions to the search firm, sort of collaborating through the entire process. Once the board's team is composed and approved, we would engage the services of an executive search firm we believe is qualified to lead a CEO recruitment. There are a lot of search firms in the industries, but there are specific firms that has the expertise and experience to be able to target and seek CEOs that are interested in applying for this position. The search firm would conduct a comprehensive national search for candidates and make a recommendation of several shortlisted candidates to the search committee for consideration and review. The search committee would then make a decision on the number of candidates to interview, and we would schedule those interviews, and the 4 members of the committee would lead the interview process in collaboration with myself and the head of the executive search firm. So it's going to be a collaborative process, but the board search committee conducts the interview itself. Upon completion of the interview process, the board would either make a recommendation for an outstanding top candidate to the overall board for a possible interview and a vote, or they could recommend the 2 top candidates, if there's no single outstanding top pick, to the overall board, and the board could choose to interview the 2 top candidates and then make a recommendation on who they believe is qualified as the next general manager CEO of this agency. Once the board makes a decision to that effect, we will be presenting the board with a salary and compensation survey data that shows all top transportation agencies and their compensation ranges, including all incidental and things that are typically included in a general compensation package for a new CEO. Then the board gets to appoint a general manager CEO in a public meeting. And once that's done, prior to the appointment in the public section, VTA would engage in negotiations and reach an employment contract that is reviewed by the board, approved by the board before the public section, and the approval and appointment of a new general manager CEO. I will be sharing later today in closed session a lot more in-depth specific information pertaining to this process with the board to outline some of the options we have on the table as to how we proceed with this process. Thank you, and I'm going to pause and take questions.
Okay, thank you, Sylvester. Thanks for giving us a highlight of the hard, complex job that's in front of us. I'm going to go ahead and open the public comments real quick. We have 1 speaker. Can we go ahead and go to the public comment?
Yes, I would also like to note for the record that Member Perales has joined us.
Thank you.
Okay, Roland, you may begin speaking when ready.
Thank you. So with regards to Caltrain, I think basically just about anybody is more qualified than Tim Hartnett for the job. So I'll offer to throw my hat in the ring and offer to do Jeffrey Tumbling at Caltrain, so that leaves it down to 5. And as far as filling in Nuria's shoes, I think I will pass. Thank you.
Okay, that was only public speakers. I'm going to close the public comments. Real quickly, is there any comments from my colleagues? I'm not seeing any, so we're going to go ahead and move on. But I just want to add one last thing before we move forward. So it is up to the chair to create this 4-person ad hoc committee. I didn't want to do that before the board heard what was going on right here. So if there are any of my board colleagues that are interested in participating in that role, go ahead and send me an email later today, because I'm probably going to try and make the decision this afternoon or over this weekend. So if you're interested, please let me know and just send me an email about that. So that brings us to the end of item 2.2. That was an informational item. So at this time, I'd like to entertain a motion to postpone the special meeting, item number 3, closed session, until 11:30 today. So is there a motion to do that?
So moved.
Who is that? Is that Rich? And is there a second?
Constantine.
Yeah.
Second.
Who is the second?
Jones.
Jones.
Second. Okay, great.
All right.
Elaine, can we do a vote?
Bert,
Yes.
Carrasco. I'll come
Yes.
back to you.
Yes.
Thank you. Chavez,
Yes.
Constantine,
Aye.
Jimenez,
Yes.
Ricardo,
Yes.
Montano,
Yes.
Paul,
Aye.
Perales. I'll come back to you. Semidian,
Aye.
Jones,
Aye.
Hendricks,
Yes.
Perales. Okay, so Davis.
Yes.
All right, thank you. Motion passed. Thank you.
Okay,
I'm sorry,
so we,
Perales was an aye. Apologize.
Thank you.
okay. So we will continue the special meeting later this morning. Thank you all. We're almost on time. So now I'm calling the workshop meeting to order now at 9:19. Talia, do we still have everyone present from earlier? Or
Yes, we do.
Okay, so we don't have to do a roll call again. So we're at item number 2 is public comments for items not on the agenda. This portion of the meeting is reserved for persons desiring to address the board of directors on any item within our jurisdiction. Speakers are limited to 1 minute. The law does not permit us to take any action on these. I encourage those with customer service concerns to contact our customer service department after you make your comments. We will now start public comments. Are there any public comment speakers? Talia, let's get them started. Looks like we have 2.
Very good. It looks like we have 2. Roland, followed by Blair. Roland, you may begin speaking when ready.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Apologies to anybody who's heard this before. As you may recall, former Director Camis asked multiple times how BART Phase 1 could possibly be 3 years late and still be under budget. The short answer is that there were 2 sets of books for expenses, and the set of books that was not part of the FTA full funding agreement total $1.1 billion and was not reported to the board. This is what is resulted in a projected $1.1 billion debt service by the time Measure A sunsets 15 years from now. The problem was further compounded last week when WSP Parsons Brinkhouse submitted the EPD application for BART Phase 2, which included $2 billion in Measure A funds. This is not going to work when you consider we've got to support bus and light rail and the extension to Eastridge. In closing, I'm asking this board to revisit the BART project, including the funding approach. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Our next speaker, please.
Next speaker is Blair. You may begin speaking when ready.
Hi, to try to get through this. Happy New Year, happy inauguration time, and a welcome to new VTA committee persons. As the ideas of equity and reimagine can actually be some of the better ideas and reasoning of our society at this time, it is from this there needs to be much more local and Bay Area input and dialogue, and how 5+ shot spotter, eavesdropper, gunshot technology speakers can do the same amount of work as the current 60+ at the North San Jose Bay Area BART station. The VTA also needs to better develop open public policies that have a more immediate review period for questionable or controversial big belly smart trash can apps like ShotSpotter that can infringe upon civil rights and civil protections. And to conclude, I hope the VTA will establish some sort of advertising ethics review board and public process review for any new large advertising that is placed in the future VTA transit hubs, and that intends to work toward the ideas of equity, reimagine, and peace. Thank you.
Thank you, Blair. We have one more speaker. Redmi, begin speaking when you are ready.
This guy is covered.
Redmi, you may begin speaking.
I think we're gonna
I think
move on from this public speaker.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm not seeing any other public comments right there.
Mr. Chair,
Yes,
if I may just respond real quickly to one of the public comments regarding the BART project.
sure.
And because of the Brown Act, I can only briefly respond to it because it's not agendized. But what I want to point out in regard to the BART project is that we have what we call an SVRT program, which is the full 16 miles. That 16 miles also includes various aspects, not only BART phase 1, which is the first 10 miles, and BART phase 2, which is the last 6 miles, but also the Warm Springs extension, the Mission Warren Truck Rail project. All of that information was provided to the board. What the public speaker is commenting on is a comparison of that number for the full program versus the information that we provide to the FTA, which is the federal project, for the federal project, which is just the first 10 miles, the SVBX extension. I just wanted to clarify that information.
Okay, thank you. So with that, we're going to move on to our workshop items. Again, I want to remind my colleagues, we're going to have a hard stop at 11:30. So we have a lot of stuff we're going to try and go ahead and get through here. And with that, we're going to jump right in. Our first item is Agenda 3.1, which is to receive a presentation on VTA's Public Transportation Agency Safety Plan, the PTASP. And Angelique Gaeta, the Chief of Systems Safety and Security, and Suzanne Lucerno, Safety Manager, are going to provide the presentation. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. Next slide, please. So good morning, Chair and members of this board. For those I haven't had the pleasure of meeting yet, I am Angelique Gaeta, VTA System Safety and our Chief of System Safety and Security, and with me is our Safety Manager, Susan Lucero, to help me give this presentation. So to begin, on June 19th of 2020, VTA's sitting board of directors adopted the agency's PTASP, Public Transportation Agency Safety Plan. Under federal law, VTA is required to ensure that our board fully understands and supports that plan. And with new members joining our board, it's timely to do a briefing. This briefing will provide an overview of VTA's commitment to making the agency and its operations as safe as possible for its employees, its customers, and the public who live and travel near our system. Next slide, please. To do that, I need to give you a bit of a history around the PTASP. As a recipient of federal funds, VTA is required to follow federal regulations. For example, VTA must maintain and operate under a plan to keep its system operating safely. Originally, that plan was the System Safety Program Plan. However, several years ago, the FTA decided to engage in a study of the safety of transit agencies nationwide. The study revealed that incidents occurring on transit systems had increased over the years, and that transit agencies weren't doing enough to make system safety a priority. As a result, the FTA decided that safety culture needed to be improved on a national level. And to do that, they came up with a PTASP, which is a more comprehensive approach to system safety than the original System Safety Program Plan. And I apologize in advance because I'm going to say safety a lot throughout this presentation, but that's how important it is. Each agency was required to have an approved PTASP in place by July of 2020, which VTA did. Next slide, please. Before we discuss the details of VTA's plan, it's important to talk about safety culture and why it's so critical to our plan. Safety culture is essentially an agency's attitude towards safety of its system, its employees, and its riders. If, for example, an agency is not fully committed to safety, it will be apparent in the way that management responds and allocates resources. So how can VTA support and enhance safety culture? by doing the things that are listed there on the slide: prioritizing safety, openly and effectively communicating with staff, offering continuous opportunities to learn, and so on. Next slide, please. So let's explore how safety culture is reflected in VTA's PTASP. To begin, VTA's PTASP is based on the 4 pillars found in all safety management systems, which we call SMS. Those pillars include safety management policy, safety risk management, safety assurance, and safety promotion. These 4 pillars combine to provide VTA with a collaborative approach to managing safety and a mechanism for bringing management and its employees together. Next slide, please. We begin with the first pillar of safety management systems, which is a safety management policy. And for VTA, that policy is reflected in its statement, which is the beginning of our PTASP. The statement is the foundation of VTA's plan and sets the tone for the success of VTA. So I'll give you a moment to read that statement, but what should stand out to you are 2 things: that safety is a core value of VTA, and that VTA's executives and board of directors are responsible for ensuring that organizational resources are allocated in furtherance of this commitment. Next slide, please. Susan?
What does that mean? In short, it means being able to identify and mitigate hazards. A hazard is defined as any real or potential condition that can cause injury, illness, or death, damage to or loss of facilities, equipment, vehicles, or infrastructure of a public transportation system, or damage to the environment. These conditions may be operational, occupational, environmental, or related to agency policies. Through VTA's PTAS, all VTA employees and contractors are responsible for identifying and reporting hazards encountered during the course of their duties. Next slide, please. In order to assist them in identifying and reporting hazards, our safety and compliance team has distributed safety information cards to all VTA staff and contractors. An example of what is included in those cards is shown here. You will notice that the cards list the type of hazards that are reportable and the methods for reporting them. The card also serves as a valuable reminder to staff that safety is everyone's responsibility. And since they are the eyes and ears of our system, they have the best opportunity to see hazards as they may be present. In the fall of 2020, the team began distributing information cards to all frontline employees at bus and rail yards and our paratransit center. We are currently distributing them to administrative employees at River Oaks in our customer service center. Following this meeting, our team will work with our board secretary to ensure all board members receive an information card as well. Next slide, please. Another way VTA manages risk is through our transit asset management plan. The plan requires that VTA maintain a risk register, which identifies all of our assets and their remaining useful life. The risk of those assets failing is then analyzed by conducting a risk assessment where each asset receives a risk score for the following: safety and security impact, environmental impact, service delivery impact, financial impact, public relations and reputation impact, legal impact, and corporate information systems impact. For example, if the overhead wire that electrifies our overhead catenary system, or OCS, on our light rail trains was analyzed using the above model under safety and security impact, any failure of the wire would have catastrophic consequences. Even if the possibility of a failure occurring was remote, catastrophic consequences would still be considered serious, as shown in the orange square. And VTA would need to evaluate mitigating factors to determine whether the asset should be taken offline. Those factors could include whether the wire was scheduled for replacement. It's important to note that prior to this register being fully implemented through our PTest, VTA has already performed a risk analysis of the overhead wire and was in the process of beginning a rehabilitation project to replace the overhead wire in certain areas of the system. 2 phases of the project have already been completed to date, and staff is currently working on a 3rd phase. The risk assessment performed for this project will be critical should staff need the board to approve additional funding for the project. Separately, the risk register that includes all VTA assets will be equally important as staff prioritizes other projects it may present to the board for funding. Next slide, please. The third pillar of SMS is safety assurance and requires VTA to ensure that actions it has taken to manage risk are actually effective. How is it done? Through the systematic collection, analysis, and assessment of data, rules compliance testing, facilities and equipment inspections, maintenance audits and inspections, event investigations, and drug and alcohol testing. Here's an example. VTA is regulated by the FTA and the California Public Utilities Commission. Let's say that as a result of an accident investigation involving a light rail train, the CPUC identifies an area of concern about the light rail system, and VTA offers a solution to address the concern that requires a change to its operation. During the implementation of the change, per safety assurance processes provided for in our PTest, staff would perform an analysis and assessment of how the change would impact operations. If during the assessment, staff discovers that a new hazard will be created as a result of the change, VTA would reach out to the CPUC and explore alternative approach to addressing their concern. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Susan. Before I go through this slide, I did want to let the board members know something that wasn't mentioned in the beginning, but is worth mentioning now. A lot of these pillars that we're walking you through that make up the components of our PTASP are things that VTA was already doing as requirements through its original SSPP. What we are doing now is an enhanced version of that and a more comprehensive approach. So when we're talking about projects that have already occurred prior to the PTASP, it's because we were following the principles of these 4 pillars. So an example of how safety assurance has worked in the past is with VTA's CCTV project. And what you see in the picture is what the operator in a light rail train views as they are sitting in the front cab. To the right is the screen, and if you will, imagine that as a rear view mirror, so you're looking or seeing what is sort of behind you. This project was an upgrade to all cameras, the recording system, and the monitor within the operating cab of the light rail tray due to our outdated camera system. So during each phase of the project, there was a member of every department to assess the needs, the product provided, and the functionality of the system. During the assessment, concerns were raised with placement of the monitor that you see there in the picture to ensure that it was not obstructing any views of the operator, delay of the feed from the forward-facing cameras on the rear of the second car. So if you can imagine a 2-car train and a camera at the rear of the second car, and that camera is facing forward, what you're seeing is what someone standing at the end of that train would see looking forward. And that was causing some disorientation from our operators. If you're driving a vehicle, you want to see what's behind you, not necessarily looking forward, because you can already see in that direction. So it was causing some disorientation and a possible hazard for when customers exited and entered that second car of the train, because there was a delay in the feed from the camera on the second car to the first car. There were also some issues related to brightness and glare on the screen itself. And then there were some noted recording system failures. So safety assurance really had all the departments in a hands-on approach during the entire installation and testing of the system. These things were identified, and because of safety assurance, we were able to make changes to the system. We placed the monitors in a place that did not obstruct views. We disconnected the feed between the second and first car so that operators were not disoriented. And there was no delay in that feed. We offered the operators a dial that allowed them to adjust the brightness and glare of the image that was on the monitor. And that accounted for the change in the daylight and also any sensitivity with their eyesight. And then we also had the manufacturer respond in a manner that ensured that everything was recorded that was captured while we were in operation. And that's an example of safety assurance working in this instance. Next slide, please.
Last pillar is safety promotion. Safety promotion is broken into 2 elements: staff competencies and training, and safety communication. To ensure staff competencies and proper training is provided, the PTest identifies safety sensitive roles and outlines the expertise and training needed by each, including initial training, competency training, refresher training, and recertification. VTA management is also responsible for identifying employees whose job function required general safety or job-specific training. These individuals will receive the applicable training, refresher training, and/or recertification as needed. For example, roadway worker protection certification is required on an annual basis for anyone that will be working in, on, or around the light rail right-of-way. The training includes requirements for ensuring individuals move safely through the right-of-way, are in communication with VTA's Operational Control Center before and after exiting the right-of-way, and maintain a safe distance from operating trains. Next slide, please. The other half of safety promotion is safety communication. To satisfy this pillar, VTA disseminates information to help educate its employees on potential hazards and safety risk relevant to their roles and responsibilities. On this slide, you'll see some of the ways VTA has communicated with and will communicate with employees, including posters and safety boards. The boards will provide a location for all safety-related documents and if employees have questions or concerns about safety. They know where to look and who to contact for additional information. The boards will also provide employees with a copy of safety memos issued by the Chief of System Safety and Security. The team also provides an all hazards presentation at every new employee orientation to ensure employees joining VTA become familiar with safety measures we have in place and programs that we have available. Next slide, please. So how does VTA know how it's doing? As part of the PTest requirement, agencies were to select performance measures appropriate for their operations and environment. Performance measures were considered to be successful if they were specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound, SMART. For light rail, VTA set a measure to have less than 45 total events annually, 0 fatalities annually, and less than 24 injuries annually. For system reliability, VTA's goal is to have greater than 50,000 miles between major mechanical failures. Next slide, please. For bus, our measure is to have less than 150 total events annually, 0 fatalities annually, and less than 50 injuries annually. For system reliability, our goal is to have greater than 30,000 miles between major mechanical failures. Per our PTest process, the safety and compliance team will reevaluate these performance measures on an annual basis. Next slide, please.
And that concludes our presentation. If you have any questions or would like a copy or another copy of the PTASP, if you had received one in the past, please reach out to us directly. A copy of the PTASP is also available on our hub. And we'll take any questions. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you. I think that's just a really just very quick pass into the important stuff that you guys are working on in the safety world. I'm going to go ahead and go to our public comments first. Talia, could you have our public speakers first, and then we'll go to the board.
Yes, we have 3 speakers. We'll have Roland, Eugene, and Blair. Roland, you may begin speaking when ready.
Thank you. In the interest of time, I'm going to get straight to the point here. Security is extremely important, but today is not the time to give this presentation. Please refer future presentation to SSTPNO, which is the appropriate committee for this, and then consider agendizing these presentations on board meeting consent agendas. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker, please.
Eugene, you may begin speaking when ready.
Good morning once again, board members. This is Eugene, Silicon Valley Transit Users. I echo Mr. LeBrun's comments. Also, I don't know if this is the proper item to address it, but VTA needs to reconsider its decision to not have rear door only boarding. I just learned that 50 VTA drivers alone have tested positive for COVID this month alone. This is one likely causes that the front door boarding has caused, even with social distancing laws, still caused people to get sick. So gotta bring that back. You can't brag about safety and then make buses unsafe by not allowing rear door only boarding for free, which allows everybody to be safe. Please reconsider that decision now. Thank you.
Thank you. And our next speaker.
Our next speaker is Blair. You may begin speaking when ready.
Hi, thank you. I'll be speaking of former General Manager Fernandez a lot today. Thank you for her work and efforts to help understand how there can be, for the paratransit vehicles, there can be a cleaning schedule that can develop, and it can be a good cleaning schedule that actually can be introduced to the public. And there can be, just give and take to learn about what can be an overall better practices. And that's the kind of things to involve the public, that you develop a better overall system. Learn to involve the ATU more in these practices of safety and talk about them more in the public process here. I think that would be a more engagement and bring better practices for all of us. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. That was our last speaker. So I'm going to close the public comment section and I'm going to go back to my colleagues. Do my colleagues have any comments or questions? And if you're new here, I'm just looking for raised hand stuff. So I'm going to be going once, going twice. I'm not seeing any comments or questions from my colleagues. So thank you very much, Angelique, for the presentation about this. This is an information item, so we don't need to take any action. I'm going to moving on to item 3.2, which is update on the fiscal year 2021 budget and upcoming fiscal year 2022-2023 biennial budget. Kathleen Kelly, our interim chief financial officer, is going to provide this presentation. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Chair Hendricks. Let's move straight to the agenda slide. This presentation is for informational purposes only, and much of the information was actually presented to the board in the past few months, but we wanted to take this opportunity to bring new board members up to speed with the budget. So I'll start with the current year budget and go over the most recent projections that were presented last month to the board. And then I'd like to talk a bit about federal funding that's been provided for transit. And here I do have some new updates from what we knew last month. I will talk briefly about service levels, where we've been over the last year and where we will be in the next few months, and then give a quick overview of the upcoming biennial budget and with a timeline of future board actions. Next slide, please. This slide coming up was presented to the board last month, and it shows two things. It shows the current year budget, which is in the left column, and then it shows the preliminary financial projections for the year based on actual data for the first few months. So if you look at the first column, it's important to remember that this budget was the second year of a biennial budget. And so this was developed long before we knew anything about coronavirus. And if you follow down to close to the last row and you see the operating balance, there was a slight projected deficit for the current year. It was anticipated that the gap could be closed with additional revenues or by cutting back on expenses or using reserves. That last number there at the bottom, the 124 million, actually, there was no CARES Act thought at the time. So that was really that we put that in just to follow the arithmetic that we used in the other columns. But I'd like to focus your attention on the last three columns where we have a range of projections for the bottom line. And the key row here is the very first one, the sales tax row, which is so critical for VTA because that's about 75 to 80% of all of our revenues. And you can see that there's a $31 million difference between the conservative projection of $354 million and the optimistic projection of $385 million for sales tax. I've been doing operating budgets for Bay Area transit properties since the 1980s, and I can tell you we've never before had a time where we'd have such wildly divergent estimates, but it speaks to the uncertain territory that we've been in. The good news is that at the last board meeting, we heard from one of the professors at UCLA, which is where we get one of our sales tax models, and they have much rosier sales tax projections now than they did last summer when this was produced. We're currently working on our second quarter projections. We'll be showing those to the A&F committee next month, but I can tell you that we are going to come out much closer to the optimistic scenario shown on the far right of the page than the other scenarios. I'm going to be talking in a bit about the federal funding, but I do want to show you that from this table, you can see that if we do wind up with actuals similar to the optimistic, the ones that are shown here, we will have a healthy amount of federal funding for future years as well as to close this year. So before we leave this page, I just want you to look one more time at that sales tax related line, because the next slide shows a little bit of what goes into that. So let's have the next slide, please. This shows that there are 5 different components to the sales tax revenue. But the bottom line is that they are all sales tax and they go in the same direction. So when times are good, these numbers go up. When times are bad, they go down. Let's go to the next slide. As you know, the federal government made funding available to transit agencies last summer, and VTA received about $141 million from the CARES Act. We used some of that funding to close the budget gap for the year that ended last June. And then we had about $136 million available for to bridge the budget gap in this year and subsequent years. And then in just last month in 2020, in December, there was an additional law that allocated that gave about $14 billion for public transit throughout the country, and about $975 million will be coming to the Bay Area. Next week, on January 27th, the MTC will vote on an initial distribution of those new funds. And we now know that they're going to recommend allocating about $180 million to 5 transit operators. And those, the allocations that they're coming out with next week are based on actual revenues from March of last year when the pandemic started through December. Some of you will recall that the initial money was based on projected revenue losses. Now we have actual revenue losses. And so the 5 properties that will be allocated money next week are BART, SFMTA, Golden Gate Transit, Caltrain, and WITA, which runs the ferries. That does not include VTA. It still leaves about $800 million to allocate, and the formula for that allocation is very much still being discussed in the region. Let's go to the next slide. I want to just review transit service levels that VTA has been offering. In December of 2019, VTA implemented the new transit service plan, and it focused more resources than before on corridors with high ridership and frequency. But right after that, in March, that's when everything broke loose. And with the pandemic, ridership immediately dropped about 75%, and we decreased service by about 60%. Between April and now, ridership has fluctuated, but it remains down by about 70 to 75%. We have gradually increased service levels to the point now where we're offering about 74% of what we offered before. But transit capacity has been greatly reduced because of the orders regarding social distancing. And so we really are only offering about 10 to 20% of the capacity that we had before. Next month in February, VTA will increase service frequency on 7 bus routes, and that's intended to reduce passenger pass-ups, and that will bring us to an overall system-wide service level that's about 80% of where we were before the pandemic. Next slide, please. I want to touch briefly on the process for the upcoming biennial budget. The VTA board approves operating and capital budgets every 2 years, and that's for a fiscal year that starts on July 1st. This is a year when the board will be adopting a two-year budget. And for new members, the VTA budget is rather complex, and it includes funding for fixed route and paratransit service, but also for other programs. And you can see on this page, there are 8 independent funds that are included in the VTA budget. Some of those are for operating and capital both. Some of them are for one or the other. But I do want to draw your attention to the line there that says 2016 Measure B program, because that's the component that we're talking about in the next presentation. And I want you to see that that fits here into this 2-year budget. Next slide, please. And this slide shows a timeline of upcoming board actions. And at the top, you can see upcoming board actions that are related to the current year budget. So Starting next month with A&F and then going to the board, we'll be bringing our second quarter statement of revenues and expenses. We'll do the third quarter later on. And then the bottom part of this chart shows the upcoming board actions related to the biennial budget. And here I want to draw your attention to the April 16th board budget workshop. That's the time that we will present to you our preliminary recommendations. In May and then in June, you'll see that there's action on both sides. You'll see information from the third quarter for this current year, and then the A&F committee and then the board will be reviewing and then adopting the final budget. So that's just some kind of highlights of where we're going. We wanted to bring everybody up to speed on that. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Kathleen, for all that information about what's going on. I'm going to go ahead and go to our public speakers first. So if we can go ahead and have our public speakers, Talia, and then we'll come back to the board for their comments and questions.
Very good. We've got 10 speakers. First three will be Daniel, Charlotte, and Tessa. Daniel, you may begin speaking when ready.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, good. Well, with more relief funds on the way, it's important that we focus on transit operations because obviously as the pandemic has shown us is a keystone that allows workers to keep their jobs and save money, and this will be especially important in the aftermath of the pandemic. And of course, we can also allows us to maintain the progress we have made in combating in reducing our carbon footprint. Thank you.
Thank you.
Very good. Our next speaker will be Charlotte. Please accept the unmute and begin speaking when ready.
Hi, my name is Charlotte. I am a resident of San Jose. When I am able to work in the office, I will resume taking VTA buses to commute to work, and in the past always took VTA buses and Caltrain to work. I also want to urge everyone to prioritize transit operations, like making sure that we maintain and expand, especially buses, instead of using the budget elsewhere, because this is very, very critical to equity. It's critical to helping to combat climate change. It's basically just very, very critical to the community. So please use the money to prioritize expanding and maintaining public transit, but especially buses. We really, really need them. Thank you.
Thank you.
Very good. Tessa, followed by Mark and Gavin. Tessa, you may begin speaking when ready.
Yes. Good morning. This is Tessa Woodman C. As the VTA has declared a climate emergency, and built into that format is that we must look at everything in terms of our greenhouse gases. And so what we need to do is to realign the Measure B, which is our community assets from our sales tax, which needs to be reduced because we need to be a hyper-local economy. We need to stay home. That is the cry of climate change and the cry of COVID-19. So things are changing and we need to adapt to those radically, quickly. And what that means is that we need to realign Measure B. We need to stop the expansion to Santa Clara. It needs to take all that money of that expansion, which is almost over $1 billion, and use that to create a transit system that is walkable and bikeable. That's where our infrastructure needs to come into, is to create a world-class bicycle infrastructure and walking infrastructure, and a bus system that is local and hyper-local is our mantra.
Thank you. Tessa or Talia, before we take our next speaker, can you go ahead and close the queue for additional speakers coming in?
Yes, our last speaker will be Brian. Everyone who's in line will be able to speak. Mark, you may begin speaking when ready.
Thank you.
So I'm also heavily in support of using the money to fund bus transportation for people who need it, especially in disadvantaged communities and people who don't have, well, anyway, so there's that. And I think that for the future, expanding the buses until you can put up a group rapid transit system that's elevated and very inexpensive when done right. So this has been tested out, and a quarter scale working model was developed in 2000, and people didn't buy it because it wasn't not already used somewhere else. So that's something that might be solved fairly soon. And it would be good to be budgeting for the buses, and then in the research area, looking at putting up group rapid transit network that would get people there without spending a lot of diesel. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Before we go on to the next public speakers, I wanted to note that we have received 2 written public comments from Roland, which are included in the online packet. Our next 3 speakers will be Gavin, David, and Callie. Gavin, you may begin speaking when ready.
Thank you. I think we'll just move to the next speaker.
Yes. Gavin, you may begin speaking when ready. Wait.
Oh, that we just did.
I'm sorry. David, you may begin speaking when ready.
Hello, my name is David. I'm here with Turnout for Transit, and I wanted to give public comment in support of prioritizing transit operations in the upcoming budget, because before the pandemic, I was taking transit to work. I will be taking transit to work afterwards. Having a system that allows me to get to work without owning a car is really important, not just for my own financial purposes, but also because it helps with climate, traffic, housing affordability, all of those other good things that we want to prioritize as we move toward a more equitable future for the South Bay and also for the Bay Area at large. So I hope that you will allocate more funding to transit operations in the budget so that we can recover quickly and that the transit system can improve beyond what it was before COVID. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, David. Our next speaker is Callie. You may begin speaking when ready.
Hello, VTA board. Good morning. I would just, hello?
Yes, we're here.
Hello, VTA board. Good morning. My name is Callie. I'm from Cupertino. I just wanted to encourage the board to prioritize transit operations funding for the budget in coming years. This is such a critical part of a transportation network. I'm from Cupertino. I know a lot of people rely on transit to get around, and they're disproportionately very young or very old and often don't speak English. So they may not be the ones to call into a board meeting, but their needs matter too. And I just wanted to emphasize how important this is to move people around without using as much greenhouse gases and to get as much service as we can out there. It's the basic fundamental of any transportation system. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Very good. Our next speaker is Roland, followed by Kevin and Blair. Salim and Estelle, you have joined after we've closed public comment. Roland, you may begin speaking when ready.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So to the transit advocates, I would really, well, first of all, thank you for Kathleen for this outstanding presentation and being really straightforward about the CARES Act surplus. I want everybody to look at slide number 4, which basically shows to the transit advocates that we are in very, very good shape and that we will still have a CARES Act surplus even if we basically match the current budget. There's no problem there. Now, in closing, you're going to be receiving a letter from me over the weekend responding to what the General Counsel said. And the first thing I'm going to make very clear in that letter is the problem response you got is not with the General Counsel. I'm going to point you to the people with the real problem at the PTA. And let me just say something to you. The cost of Warm Springs was $9.6 million, not $1.1 billion. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Our next speaker is Kevin. You may begin speaking when ready.
Morning, VTA board members. My name is Kevin Ma. I'm a resident of Palo Alto, and I'm here today with Turnout for Transit. As a rider of Caltrain, the 22 and the 522, transit is very important to me. We recognize that transit is a way to get to places without requiring a car, which causes environmental impact by taking up so much space via parking on our built landscape, by gas emissions, by upkeep of roads that asphalt. Because asphalt also has greenhouse gas emissions that are usually unaccounted for in most cities' GHG tracking. As a result, we need to have transit be expanded and sustained in the future. Otherwise, we are locking ourselves into an environment world that is not going to look that well, as well as also impact the economy by preventing people from actually having a good idea to just get from place to place to be able to shop at different areas without actually thinking too much about like parking or about congestion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker will be Blair, followed by Monica, Hoyan, Camilla, Eugene, and our final speaker will be Brian. Blair, you may begin speaking when.
Hi, thank you to the work of now former VTA General Manager Nuria Fernandez and her work this past fall, how to help understand and rebalance BART Phase 2 budgeting and Measure B funding with the needs of emergency money for transit service and operations in this stressful time of COVID-19. Also, a thank you at this time to all the people of local South Bay communities and their patience to understand how VTA VRT funding can work to address road maintenance needs and possibly in terms of wildfire and earthquake preparedness for the next few years until we can more formally leave the era of COVID-19. Robin Romer has written a good letter in public comment today of this item that describes how new budgeting ideas in this difficult time can be open and accountable. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Monica, you may begin speaking when ready.
Hi, my name is Monica Mallon, and I'm part of Turnout for Transit and Silicon Valley Youth Climate Action. And I'm a lifelong transit rider. I've never owned a car in my life, and having access to transit, especially VTA, has really made it possible to get around and just access all of the opportunities that are available here. So I really want to urge you all to prioritize funding for transit operations and health and safety in the upcoming budget so that transit can make a successful recovery. Specifically, I want to urge you all to really make sure that the funding from the CARES Act and second stimulus bill is going to transit operations and health and safety only, and also looking into using the funding flexibility that MTC recently approved and Measure A funds that aren't needed for the Caltrain subsidy anymore because Measure RR passed. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Our next speaker will be Hoyan. You may begin speaking when ready.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great. I'm Wayan Trong with Mothers Out Front. I urge you to increase transit operations in the upcoming budget and for the next 10 years. We have 10 years or less to reverse the climate crisis. We cannot possibly meet our climate goals without increasing public transit. I live in San Jose. I do not own a car. Pre-COVID, to travel just 5.5 miles to a previous contract from where I live now, I would have had to leave home 1 hour and 40 minutes early to get to work on time. If service is cut, it could take even longer, not just for me, but for many other transit riders. It could also put thousands more cars on the road because more parents will have to drive kids to school. Please prioritize and increase transit service. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry, our next speaker is Camila, followed by Eugene and Brian. Stephanie, you will not be allowed to speak as public comment has already closed on this item. Thank you.
Hello, can you all hear me?
Yes, we can.
Hello, my name is Camilla. I'm a resident of San Jose. I have been a public transport rider user, and I support the funding of the transit system. Funding the transit system would be a crucial resource for disadvantaged communities, people of color, and low-income folks, and it would speak to how this area the Silicon Valley serves the working class, mostly when the working class is trying to survive in an economy that's the most expensive in the country. Furthermore, if this area plans to be the blueprint of where the state goes regarding climate change, it needs to take immediate action and set the example for the rest of the state. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Eugene, you may begin speaking when ready.
Morning once again, board members. Eugene Bradley, Silicon Valley Transit users. I echo the prior comments of the other speakers about the need to really preserve transit operations in the upcoming budget, especially for the next 10 years. It is galling every time that a ballot measure passes promising increases in bus service, that within a few months after such a passage, service cuts are made. Perfect example, 2000 Measure A. Soon as that passed in November, 3 months later, bus service cuts were initiated by VTA. Even with 2016, after its Measure B, after its passage, a few months later, bus service cuts. This sends a poor message about really the priorities of VTA and where it's been the last 20 years. Let's get these priorities changed and really prioritize transit operations funding in this budget for everybody's sake. Thank you.
Thank you.
And our final speaker will be Brian. You may begin speaking when ready.
All right, thank you. So, hi, for the record, my name is Brian Prescott. I'm a member of the Silicon Valley Bicycle Coalition and South Bay YIMBY. I live in San Jose and I take VTA everywhere. I take the bus to get food for myself. I take the bus to get food for my cats. So transit operations are very important to me. I'm very glad to hear about the optimistic projections for sales tax revenue and relief from the CARES Act. And basically, I'd just like to echo the support for funding transit ops out of the budget. I think people have made a lot of good points. I would just add that right now, we've got a moratorium on evictions statewide and a moratorium on student debt interest nationwide. So it's really not a great time for people to be taking out $10,000 or $15,000 in debt to buy a car. So good to hear about the surplus. Let's keep buses rolling. It sounds like we can. Thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you. That was our last public speaker. I'm going to go ahead and go back to my colleagues on the board. And it looks we have first Supervisor Simidian. Supervisor, are you there?
Forgive me, Mr. Chairman, were you speaking out to me?
Yes. You had your hand raised?
Thank you. I'm sorry, I'm having a little technical difficulty. Yes, I just wanted to ask Ms. Kelly, if I could, for a quick timing question, which is when on the calendar and timeline that we saw, when the board would be expected to vote on the Measure B 10-year program. I don't think it was explicitly called out on the timeline, and I've heard a couple of different dates offered up in prior conversations.
Kathleen,
yes,
are you there?
And I am here, and if Marcella is on here, you can correct me. I believe that we usually try to approve the Measure B in May, and then it is a component of the budget in June. Marcella, am I correct about that?
You are correct.
So just so there's no confusion, and thank you, that's a helpful piece of information. Notwithstanding the fact that the budget would be presumably approved in June, the action on the Measure B component of the budget would likely take place in May. And is that May 20 date that we're seeing on the screen the operative date, or is there another date? Just for those of us who are concerned about this particular set of issues, can have a clear target for resolution.
It would be the date of the May board meeting, which I do not have in front of me.
May 20th is the A&F committee.
Mr. Chair, this is Elaine
Okay.
from the board office.
Let's Elaine wants to jump in here.
Yeah, the main board meeting's on May 6th.
May 6th. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That's helpful. It sounds like that's the date that then we need to target, if I understand it correctly, for resolution on that set of issues that we're going to be addressing in just a couple of minutes. Yes?
Yeah, and we're going to go into a little bit more detail of that here in just a couple minutes.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Do any of my colleagues have any other thoughts or questions they would like to add? Mr. Mayor Ricardo.
Hey, thank you, Chair. Kathleen, really appreciate the presentation. Very clear. Just a question about the additional federal dollars that were flowing through, I assume through MTC. Do we have any sense why the priority was given to those 5 agencies, WETA, Golden Gate, and the others, for dollars before there was an allocation decision on the remaining 800 million?
Yes. So what they decided to do was what they called a true up, because when the initial allocations were made last summer, they asked for projections for revenue losses. And so they wanted to, now that we have actuals, to go back and look at those. And that's why those 5 agencies were prioritized.
Okay, and I'm sure there's a flurry of staff negotiation over that remaining 800 million. Is there anything that you can reveal to us now? Is there anything you can reveal to us now, or is everyone sworn to secrecy?
Well, no, it's not sworn to secrecy. People are really trying to figure out what is the best way to, what are the best components to look at. So obviously ongoing revenue loss, but people are also talking about equity and then trying to define equity. So we're trying to be transparent, but there's just a lot of concern about what the criteria will be that they look at.
Well, if we have to all agree on defining equity, this is going to be a very long conversation, I suspect. But I look forward to the conversation at the MTC. Thank you.
Yeah, I think, Mr. Mayor, what you're really just trying to, VTA needs to be advocating as strongly as it can for its piece of that pie.
Yeah, and I would just appreciate whatever nudge staff can give us, an indication about where the opportunities and perils might be in that negotiation. So we can certainly take it up with our colleagues as well.
Okay, thank you. Supervisor Chavez.
Thank you. I wanted to reiterate the point that the mayor just made about that the board, one thing I would just like to encourage the staff through the chair is to alert the board so the board can be active both, and the public here can be active on this issue. I feel like sometimes we're a little silent at that regional level. So that's one point. The second issue that I wanted to raise is that one of the points that actually one of our colleagues at Caltrain raised, and that was Steve Heminger, is how we include transit-dependent riders in consideration around equity at a regional level. And I raise that because we have one of the most transit-dependent populations that are using our facilities. And I want to make sure our staff is really looking at transit dependency, being able to quantify it and engage at a regional level around equity on that subject. And part of the problem is that when you look at one of the measures that is being considered is the look at loss of revenue from ridership. But if your ridership is already really poor, that doesn't really help you as much as it could. So that's just something I wanted the staff to consider. And then the other thing is that I think it was SFMTA, one of them did a really great analysis on the equity of their riders, and it's got a great framework to it. And I just want to encourage our staff to take a look at it. And this was something that Jeff Tumlin, working with the community, designed a few years ago, but it's a great framework that we ought to think about how that framework aligns with us and whether or not that framework is of value to share regionally in terms of thinking about equity and therefore how resources are shared. And then one last thing that I don't think we look nearly enough at, and that is that we are an integrated system. And one of the advantages to that is I think it allows us to be more responsive to the customer. One of the disadvantages to that is that we are investing in, we're investing in ACE, we're investing in the Santa Cruz bus. I apologize, I can't recall the name of it, but we do a lot of regional investments. And I also want to make sure that, again, we aren't penalized because we're investing in other partner agencies and continuing to invest in other partner agencies, which I think is the right thing to do, but nonetheless, something that we need to make sure is part of the analysis. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm not seeing any other hands from my colleagues, so I'm going to go ahead and kind of close that section right there. I do just want to highlight to all of my colleagues, I think that this discussion from Kathleen and the public has really brought out, we have a whole bunch of work financially here, going into the next 2-year budget. There are a lot of unknowns as we take a look. And this is, not just a matter of coming up with the number budget of what it is, but how we're going to go ahead and look and what we're going to be able to do and essentially, show our value and our values in how we're going to decide what we'll do with service hours and other things like that. So I think there's going to be a bunch of more discussions that are going to come on in the next couple months. I'm really looking forward to everybody's detailed discussion into this and how we can put together the numbers with the unknowns that we have and try and do the best we can in terms of providing service out to our customers. So we have lots more to do on this. So that was information, no vote or anything required on this. We're moving on to 3.3. As we get into this, I just want to go ahead and remind everyone, we have a hard stop at 11:30. So we're going to try and go through the presentation quickly, again, to public comments, and if public can be quick with what they're trying to say. And then we're going to get into my colleagues' comments. And if we don't get through everyone's discussion as part of that, when we get to 11:30, there will be future time to discuss. So with that, I believe it's Kathleen is presenting again. Is that correct?
Yes, I'm back again, and I know that last one was just my warm up. For those of you who haven't met me, which is really most of you, because I've been virtual since I've been the interim CFO for a month, and I want to assure you that I've been here just enough time to know everything there is to know about VTA finances. So in moving right along to the next one, if you could put the agenda up. The reason that we're bringing this item on 2016 Measure B program to you today is to set the stage for developing a 10-year program of projects, as well as developing the Measure B input to the upcoming biennial budget, which we just talked about in the prior presentation. And in contrast to the last presentation, which was informational, the purpose of this item is to solicit board feedback on 2 major discussion items, and they're shown in the second and third bullets on the agenda. So I'm going to just very briefly review some history and then move on to present staff's preliminary ideas for principles for developing the 10-year program. And then they'll come back and ask for your feedback on that. And then we'll focus specifically on the need and capacity-based program and present staff's preliminary ideas for criteria to use in selecting the specific projects that will be included in the 10-year program and those that will be included in the upcoming biennial budget. And then we'll go over next steps and timeline. Moving on to slide 4 to the program history. As many of you all remember well, in 2015, the envisioned Silicon Valley process was in full force, and there were lots of meetings, and there were 32 criteria used to analyze the programs and projects, and it culminated with board adoption of a project list, and then was approved by over 70% of the voters. And then shortly after that, VTA began collecting revenue and putting them into escrow, but we were unable to disperse the funds because of a lawsuit. But nevertheless, we prepared to move on. And in 2017, program category guidelines were approved. In 2019, the funds were available for distribution. And then in 2020, staff began to develop the process to establish the 10-year program of projects. So let's move to slide 6, which has the principles here. I'd like to present staff's proposed ideas and then come back and get your thoughts on those at the end of the presentation. The first principle we're proposing is to invest in all 9 categories. And you may recall, and I'll show you in a future slide, the specific categories, but there were 9 programs. They're grouped into 2 categories. And in the first group, we have the formula-based programs. That's local streets and roads, bike ped, and transit operations. And then the second group, and there are 6 projects in here, the need capacity-based ones, and that includes BART Phase 2, Caltrain grade separations, et cetera. We'll see those in a minute. If this program, if this principle is approved, it would require that some level of investment would be included in each of the categories during the 10-year program. The second proposed principle is to apply the percentage share specified in Measure B to the formula programs on an annual basis. And so that speaks specifically to the local streets and roads bike peds, and transit operations, and says that in each year of the 10-year program and for the 2-year budget as well, the percentage that was included in the measure would be allocated. The third principle here speaks to how we would propose allocations be made to the other 6 programs. These are in the need capacity-based programs. And here we're recommending that the board approve project selection criteria that would be used to determine when a project is eligible to be in the 10-year program and when it's included in the 2-year budget. And I will show you some of our preliminary thoughts for developing those criteria, but that's obviously an area where we would need to do some more work. And the last bullet speaks to financing tools. This says that we would use financing tools to make funding available when projects are ready. So in other words, if a project meets the criteria after the board selects that for project readiness and is included in the budget, and we've made the annual allocations for the other programs, and we realize that we need more, we don't have enough revenue to cover all the proposed expenses, then we would look to issue debt to cover those costs. But as the last CFO made clear at the last board meeting, we would not be actually issuing debt until we're ready to take an action. And usually that's going to be related to construction. So moving on to slide 7, this is the slide that was shown at the last board meeting. It's not intended to be a recommended scenario. It's simply one option for allocating funds. And the reason I'm showing it here is I want to illustrate how the principles that I laid out would be factored into this. You'll see in the first column, the 9 programs that I referenced earlier. These were the ones that were specifically included in the measure. And in the second column, you'll see the percentage of program tax revenue that's included for each of those programs. So you'll recall the first principle I laid out was to invest in all 9 categories. And in this scenario that was shown to the board last month, in fact, you can see that that's the way that was followed in that case. There's an investment in each of the categories. The second principle was to apply the percentage share from Measure B to the formula-based programs on an annual basis. And if you look at the little green rectangle there, this is the 3 programs: bicycles, streets and roads, bicycle, and transit operations. And we've used those percentages from column 2 and applied those each year. And then the next one that I talked about had to do with the programs that are, you can see in the red lines. These are the need capacity-based programs. And what was used for this scenario wasn't based on any board selected criteria. What we did here was we took information provided by city and county staff to populate the needs in each year. But the principle we're recommending is that we adopt board criteria to see which programs should be included in the 10-year and in the 2-year budget. And the last principle I mentioned was the financing tools. That is illustrated in this scenario. You can see the second line where it says debt servicing and financing, and that's exactly what was done here. After the projects were put in, we had modeling done to show how much debt would be needed in order to advance those projects. So let's move to slide 9, and here I want to start to focus on the project selection criteria that we propose be applied to projects in the need and capacity-based programs. Some of these preliminary criteria that we have here are typical of items that are used at the federal, state, and local level to determine project and funding readiness. And these are also based on some very early discussions with the TAC ad hoc committee. So the first one, project delivery status, this would be where we would develop measurable milestones to determine when a project is ready to be in the 10-year program, and particularly when it's ready to be advanced to the biennial budget. And I am going to walk through a potential scenario for this on the next slide. The funding status, obviously, it's important. Almost all the projects that will be in the 2016 Measure B program also require non-Measure B funding. So this criteria looks at the status of those other funding sources, because we don't want to be programming Measure B funding if the other funds won't be available for several years. Partner agency and community support, this is fairly self-explanatory, but it's obviously very important to make sure that all of the stakeholders for a particular project are on board, or at least that process is underway before we're programming funds. And the last two criteria, the equity and climate considerations and geographic balance, we think will be important when we're looking at the full 10-year program, and these are our board priorities. Let's go to the next slide, slide 10. I want to show you how we might apply these criteria. And so for this example, we chose a hypothetical highway project, and we applied the potential criteria to determine whether it would belong in the 10-year program and in the biennial budget. So in the first line, I'll just go through that one. It addresses project delivery status. And so we would look to see if there's a plan in place to complete the environmental work. And if so, then the project could qualify for the 10-year program. If the project is even further along and there's a completed environmental process, then the project could move into the biennial budget, but we wouldn't let it into the biennial budget until we have that process completed. It could stay in the out years of the program, but not be programmed for actual funding. And the other lines there work in a similar fashion. So let's go to the next steps on slide 12. This shows that after we take your feedback today, we would work with the TAC ad hoc committee to develop recommendations on the project selection criteria. We would then bring the draft project selection criteria and the principles back with any feedback again that you've given us today, but we'd bring that back for formal approval, and then we would use those principles and criteria to develop a 10-year program as well as the biennial recommendation. And then that comes back to you for approval in May and June. Going to the next slide, this is just a visual that shows you the same tasks and the timelines. The top part of it is related to the VTA board, and the bottom part is related to the staff and TAC work that would need to be done. Let's go to the next slide. And then, as I mentioned before, this is one where we really are seeking your feedback on those preliminary principles and criteria. And when we get to that point, we'll bring those back up to the board so that we're all looking at those. It's page 6 and page 9 of the presentation. Thank you.
So Kathleen, thank you very much. We're going to go ahead and go to our public comments in just a second, then I'll come back to the board. But I just want to reiterate, I mean, you know, people can bring up what they want, but what we're really looking for is the feedback on this selection criteria and the program principles that we want to go ahead and use. Again, I just want to note everybody about time because we're on a clock. But with that, we're going to go ahead and go to our public comments. And Talia, if we could go ahead and start them, please.
Thank you, Chair. Looks like we have two public speakers, Roland and Blair. Roland, you may begin speaking when ready.
Thank you, Kathleen, for another honest and to the point presentation. Quite frankly, where were you when we desperately needed you? The only comment is about financing tools. I would respectfully suggest that you do a post-mortem on what happened to financing of BART phase 1 and what happened to Measure A, which eventually now we're in the situation which is impossible to finance phase 2. The gory details are in my letter attached to item 3.2. But in closing, I would like to share Nuria's last words as she was boarding a red eye to Washington. And her words were, "Thank you for keeping us honest." I framed this. It's above my screen. I'm looking at it right now in remembrance of Nuria. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker, please.
Very good. Our next speaker will be Blair, followed by Adina and Monica. Blair, you may begin speaking when ready.
Hi, thank you. I hope my words can be relevant to this item. You know, it was a really difficult time for the VTA this past year to work out their budget issues with COVID-19, how to relate that to the public, and then how to relate that to the public. But I think, you know, Nuria and staff really came through for ourselves, for the public, and in a big way. And I think they ended up doing really good things. And I thank you immensely for that. It's just a matter of how to get there. And I think we all can have stories that, the process to get there was sometimes a little difficult and clouded. I think we've all learned some good lessons, and I hope those lessons can be applied, how we can just make a more open process in how we move forward with our budgeting issues. So good luck to ourselves and to our new persons in this new year. Thank you.
Thank you. And Talia, before our next speaker, can we go ahead and just close the queue for new speakers?
Yes, I will, Chair. So our final two speakers will be Adina and Monica. Before we call on them, I would like to note that we received 2 written public comments, which are included in the online packet. One from Robin Romer and the other from the Cities Association of Santa Clara County.
Thank you.
Adina, you may begin speaking when ready.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Adina Levin with Friends of Caltrain, and wanted to comment that there's been a significant amount of progress and improvement in terms of having this proposal reflect voters' intent for funding across multiple categories that are important to voters in Santa Clara County. And this has some very good things in terms of being able to fund projects as they become ready and have their other funding lined up, et cetera. And as glad to see the criteria for equity and climate included. That will take some effort to define them for how to incorporate them in the spending plan. Including in climate, looking at vehicle miles traveled, induced demand, and how to incorporate that in the prioritization for funding. Thank you.
Thank you.
Very good. Monica will be our final speaker. You may begin speaking when ready.
Hi, this is Monica Mallon. I'm just speaking on behalf of myself. You all obviously have a lot of really difficult decisions ahead, and I just want to say that I'm really supportive of the second principle, especially as it relates to transit operations. I think it's really important to keep funding transit ops for the next 10 years. And I also really hope that there's a way for everyone to come together around a 10-year outlook. There's been a lot of conflict, but we really need to try to figure this out and get on the same page. We're all from the same county. We're all traveling through multiple cities, multiple jurisdictions, and I really hope there's some way to figure this out. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. That was our last public speaker. And now I'm going to come back to my colleagues. Again, interested in your thoughts and perspectives. And we're going to start with Member Burt.
Thank you. My question goes back to slide number 8, where the projection for the Caltrain grade separation funding is projected to be over just the next 4 years. And that was surprising. And I wondered if Kathleen or others could explain the thought process on that.
And I'll call for Marcella to give the details. But again, this information was based on what we had from Caltrain and city and county staff as of December. So it's not the final at all. It's just what we had at the time. Marcella, do you want to give some more detail on that?
Just there's only a little more to add. This came from the requests that were received from the cities. And what happened is that the entire allotment, the entire 30-year allotment was used up in those years based on those requests.
And so Pat, if I could just add, I think what it really is it just shows when, city staff and others were saying, here, yeah, let's go ahead and get this done right away. But we hadn't filtered it through these different criteria and principles yet. So that's where, things need to tie is once we have these principles, then I think we can get a more realistic projection of what some of those numbers might look like.
And can we be provided what was the basis for that generalization that the cities made that request for the full amount in that time frame? Because that just doesn't make sense to me.
Yes, we do have the letters.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Next, we're going to go to member Abekoga.
Thank you, Chair. My question is along similar lines. It was mainly due to the Caltrain projects, but more in general, this timeline, is there flexibility to shift the funding based on project readiness?
So I think Kathleen might be able to speak, but I'll just go ahead and say, I think actually the answer is yes. That's exactly this slide 7 is not really the timing of what it's going to be. And we need to use the progress, the timing or the readiness of the project as a criteria to feather out what it really should be.
Okay, yeah, so these numbers could shift based on that. Okay.
I would say
they definitely will.
They're going to move.
Will.
Okay, so that 4 years of Caltrain funding could potentially move over.
Absolutely.
And then, in regards to the selection criteria, is there further detail on? I guess I'm looking for more definition, or is it to be defined in the near future? What some of the public comment was in terms of equity, climate considerations, even looking at what does it mean to have partner agency or community support. Does partner agency support specifically mean the local funding match? Will that be defined further, or do you already have those definitions available?
No, we have thoughts on those, but we do not have those defined yet. And this is after today, and we take your feedback, the staff will go back and we'll be working with the ad hoc committee to develop those and bring them back.
Great, thank you.
And Margaret, I just want so I want to be clear. So I'm taking that you think that that's a good set of criteria to have, and that we should really clearly document and explain out what those are so everybody clearly understands.
Yes, yeah,
okay.
I do support the principles here. Just interested in getting down to the more granular of what that really means. Thanks.
Right. And I will say, here we're going to be taking board input, but also this is where the TAC is going to help participate in being able to get those created and stuff. I'm going to move on to member Rennie.
Thank you. If you could go back to slide 7 again. So there's a question there, but let me give you my thought that leads to the question. And I realize Measure B doesn't guarantee when you get your project done in the 30 years. It's not an even over, it doesn't guarantee that. But a lot of people think in terms of, I'm going to call it fairness of, this is my fair share this year. This is, for these different project categories. So with that in mind, I look at this and you look at the totals through FY21 and highway interchanges. They're supposed to be getting about 12% if you think in terms of fairness per year. But it's way over 27% in those first years. So that says to me, we've way over invested in this fairness idea in highways. And if you look at the other categories, we've underinvested in transit so far. Then if you look at what's in the potential plan going forward, highways are getting a ton more money. And this doesn't say what the fairness per year is supposed to be, or even what this table doesn't have a projected sales tax collection. So I had to make some guesses, but I calculated by the time we get to 2025, highways have over 600 million beyond their fair share per year kind of thing. Again, I realize that's not what it Measure B guarantees, but a lot of people think that way. And actually, it isn't 2027 before BART, which is part of what started this discussion, even gets to its fair share per year over the time. So with this thinking in mind, it's a two-part question. Can we dial back?
Excuse me, Rob, can you get to the question real quick? It was just pointed out to me, you're an alternate, not a member, so you'd be a member of the public. But if you could just get to your question really quick, and then we can go back to the
Okay,
priorities.
I'll try to stay in my 3 minutes then. So
well,
the
it's
question,
1 minute.
I'll go back to that later. So anyway, the question really is, can we dial back the highway interchanges that we're looking at in the future, since we're way over now? And can we think about adding maybe to the principles something that shifts us towards this fairness equity?
Okay, thanks for that. And I do think it's that we tend to get hung up on this slide, but this slide was not run through the filter of criteria we're trying to take. So I think we're going to go ahead and change, and being able to try and address the equity pieces of what you're saying, I think is good. Kathleen, correct me if I'm wrong here. There's one other piece of what we want to do. You know, we're kind of saying based on readiness, but some of these programs are going to need some amount of money to help to get to readiness. So there could also be money that gets allocated to different program levels to help them get to the EIR part and other things like that, to help be able to get to the point where they're going to be able to do go to that readiness piece. The next hand I see is Supervisor Smidian.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I've got a couple of questions before I make a comment or two and a request or two. And I understand this is the time for feedback, so I wanted to take advantage of that. I wonder if staff could clarify the distinction or difference between principles and criteria. The terms are clearly being used here as a term of art. And I've got a couple of notions I want to advance, but I want to make sure I advance them in the right category so that they are, if the majority of the board agrees, that they're embedded in the decision making. So if I could get a little clarity about the difference between a principle and the criteria, that would help. Thank you.
Kathleen?
Yes. So the principles that we talk about are broad and would really be in place for future 10-year programs. The place where we're talking specifically about criteria is that we have a principle that says that we'll want board approval of components that tell us how these projects in that, what we're looking in the screen, it's those ones that are in the red area. So these are different than the formula-based ones. We have to have some way of figuring out when a project is ready to get in. And so I would say that the principles are overarching, and the components that we're talking about, or the priorities, are for the projects in that area to tell us when they're ready to go in. So they're kind of, I guess there's principles are above.
Thank you. And if for example, let me just make this very tangible. If my goal and if the board thought the goal of the authority ought to be to ensure that funding allocations are consistent with the provisions of Measure B, and that we will prioritize projects that provide the greatest measure of congestion mitigation for the greatest number of county residents, do those fall into the category of principles or criteria, or both, or neither?
Well, I think those are principles. Those are part of the overarching framework that we'd be looking at. The criteria is just to tell us when a project is ready to be moved in.
Thank you. And I guess the question I would ask of either the staff or the chair is, if at some point my hope is that those two principles would be incorporated in our Measure B list of 10-year program principles. I know today this item is on for information only. When might it be possible and appropriate to offer those for formal consideration and action by our board?
I think what we're looking for is suggestions and comments, and then the staff could be deciding based on what we hear that's going to come back in the formal component.
Well, I will then say here are a couple of suggestions and requests. One is just on the matter of Measure B 10-year plan. I do think it would be helpful, and I would request and suggest that the timing of the May 6th decision be a little more explicit just in the public documents as a matter of transparency. I don't want the public, who will understandably be concerned about these allocations on the chart that you referred to, Mr. Chairman, page 7 that's up. I don't want the public to think that June is the decision day. I understand that the final budget adoption will incorporate the 10-year plan, but both page 8 of the budget presentation and page 13 of the Measure B presentation have timelines that could be a little clearer, and I don't think it'd be hard to do.
We can certainly get that.
All right, then I also want to specifically request and suggest that the program principles include 2 bullet points. One, that funding allocations are consistent with the provisions of Measure B. And the second bullet point is that we will prioritize projects that provide the greatest measure of congestion mitigation for the greatest number of county residents. And I just want to take note of the fact that we are a congestion management agency, as everybody is aware, and we have a 14-page PowerPoint on Measure B 10-year plan that not once mentions the phrase congestion management, congestion mitigation. I think that is very explicitly part of the Measure B commitment. I also think it's part of our obligation statutorily as a congestion management agency. But again, I want to ask you, Mr. Chairman, or the staff, understanding that all we're doing is tossing out our individual requests and suggestions and providing feedback today. Will this come back at our next meeting, for example, in a format that allows for a formal motion, if need be, to incorporate it in the principles? I just don't want us to be in a position where, if for some reason it's not included by staff, we're precluded from exercising the will of the board, whatever that may be.
So what I would say a couple different things. The first is that if other board members are kind of agreeing with you, if they could kind of, while they're going through and making their comments, say that, because I think staff, if they're hearing multiple board members say, here, we like something, that's more likely to get included in what comes back. And when it is a formal item that comes back, if there's something missing and we have to make other adjustments, that can be done as part of the formal motion process. I would ask a specific question about what you were just saying, where you were talking about specifically congestion management. Do you think we should have something that's that specific, or should we be adding a criteria that talks about outcomes of whatever a project is and how it impacts congestion management? Might just be one of those things. I just ask it that way because there may be other outcome type related things that might be appropriate to add into the concepts.
No, I think congestion mitigation, congestion management is an overarching theme that can and should be called out in that regard. I think it is. When we had the conversation from 2014 to 2016 going into the election, there were 2 initial overarching concerns that I know I articulated, and a number of others did much more work over a longer period of time. One was that we have a 25% cap on the BART extension, and the other was that there be meaningful congestion relief throughout the entire county. And I think staff has referenced geographic concerns in another slide, and I appreciate that in terms of geographic distribution. But I think, we'll all have our own views about what the public voted for, but I feel pretty clearly they voted to say, we're tired of the congestion, fix it. And I think that congestion mitigation should be called out specifically because we are a congestion management agency as well. And as they say, there is no reference to it whatsoever at the moment in the 14-page document.
Okay, well, I think that's a good call out, and because it's actually part of the language of what it is, I don't see why staff wouldn't be able to try and do that, but we'll see what comes back with that. Do you have any other thoughts, comments? Yeah.
I had a question and maybe a comment to that. On that congestion piece, I think that could certainly be another criterion that we would use to evaluate the projects in the need capacity-based programs. That's where I see that one fitting, this distinguish between a principle and a criterion. I think that that's where that one belongs. The question I have about the funding allocation piece, which I think could be a principle, but what we tried to do was get to that by saying that the principle would be that for those formula-based programs, the allocations would be done on an annual basis. The reason we didn't address the other programs is because it's really difficult with those kinds of projects to hit those targets on an annual basis. I mean, this is where we're really talking, instead of trying to do a formula allocation every year, looking at the readiness of the project by the different criteria that we lay out. So I just wonder if that is in line with what Director Simitian was thinking.
I thank you. I appreciate the feedback. I guess I continue to feel that it's important to put the words congestion mitigation there as I'm looking at that red box that you've referred us to, Ms. Kelly. And thank you for that. For me, the question is, if we spend $500 million in one place and don't have it to spend in another place, which of those two places is going to do the best job of providing congestion mitigation to the greatest degree for the greatest number of people? And it doesn't mean a project isn't worthy, doesn't mean we're not going to move forward with it, but in terms of finite number of dollars in Measure B, I thought Measure B pretty clearly suggested, indicated, committed to congestion mitigation, and I would like to be sure that that is reflected in the principles or the criteria or both, wherever it should be, because we don't want to spend $500 million and say traffic's just as bad as it used to be, and we haven't done what we should with transit or highway improvements to address mitigation concerns, which were the driving force.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Moving on, I want to go ahead and say I was contacted in the background, and I want to reach out to Member Rennie. Alternates are allowed to participate in this piece. So if you want to go ahead and get your hand back up to finish where you're at, go ahead and do that. And I apologize for cutting you off before. Next, we're going to go to Member Paul.
Great. Thank you, Chair. I have a question about the slide that's up right now on the screen, which is slide 7. So when we're talking about baseline numbers, I think it's really helpful to try to figure out how these principles translate into dollars. And so my question is, for the principles being proposed right now, are these numbers on this chart a reflection of those principles? And if not, could we get some kind of baseline numbers that could help us kind of get our numerical bearings on what's being proposed here?
What I would say about that is that the numbers in the green bracket, those are, because that's the principle is to allocate those on an annual basis. So those are roughly what we would expect to end up with. For the numbers below, they don't at all reflect where I should say, I don't know that they reflect where we'll end up, because these didn't have any criteria put on them. It was just taking information that was available from the city and county staff. So we won't really know how the numbers come out until we do more work on developing what the criteria are that suggest which projects would be included. I know that makes it difficult, but that's the best I can tell you. You could look at the ones on top and say that those are pretty close. The ones on the bottom, we really have to develop the criteria.
Okay, no, that's interesting. It's good information too. So the only thing I would add to that is the component of introducing into the baseline numbers some of the past decisions of the board and allocations and how those are affected. So for instance, for the SR 85 project, there was a board decision in October to go ahead with an alternatives analysis. Where do we place those particular decisions, and I would imagine allocations, into this whole equation? So just to get kind of a baseline, I would request that the numbers in the red box be provided to us kind of in alignment with the numbers in the green box as to how they might reflect the principles being shared. And that's pretty much it. So I guess I guess I'll ask that in the form of a question for the first part. So as to the board decisions that have already been made, how are we treating those in terms of our baseline assumptions on allocations?
This is Glenn. I would just go ahead and say, I think what you're saying, if you use the example of SR 85 and you go across that line in 2018, 2019, 2020, 2021, there were allocations that were made, and those are prior board decisions. And those allocate, SR, those different line items, I think when you look at overall Measure B, there was a total amount of money that was allocated or, kind of pied out to those different programs. And those prior decisions by the board are going to be removed from that previous pie. Does that make sense?
Well, you were making sense until the very last sentence. So, at least to me, so the previous decisions of the board, if they're on the left-hand side of the boxed out numbers, that means those are allocated and we're proceeding with those.
Yes.
Correct.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. That's all I have.
Okay, next back to member Abakoga.
Thank you. Sorry, I just remembered something. And please forgive me if this isn't the right budget discussion to bring this up, but is there room for like innovation, new technologies? Is that something that would be in the need capacity-based projects criteria? Yeah, has that been discussed anywhere? So from my part of the world, the county, we are trying to do, explore new things like automated guided transit, on-demand shuttle services with partnering with other cities to do that. Is there room somewhere here for those types of potential projects, or is that, would that be somewhere else?
Well, if it's a project that fits within these 6 items that are outlined here with the Caltrain grade separations, BART, all of that, if it's a project that could fit into one of those categories, then yes, it could be eligible. But if it doesn't fit within these categories, then no.
So I guess I'm wondering if it would fit in the need capacity-based projects category, and is innovation a potential, I guess, criteria principle that could be applied?
And again, if it fits within what's listed under need capacity-based programs, those are the specific programs that were laid out in the measure. So if there's innovation having to do with highway interchanges or something like that, yes.
But okay, but if it's not,
it is somewhat restricted.
So there really wasn't anything as another pot for new innovation.
I don't think there was an other pot in the language in the
Measure B. Okay, so would that be somewhere else in the budget when we do the 2-year
Yes.
budget? Okay, great. Thank you.
Member Liccardo.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I really appreciate this conversation and understanding clearly the timeline for decision making. I know those are important questions from Supervisor Samitian and Kathleen. I appreciate your coming into this situation and trying to move this along. And undoubtedly, there has been an odd but rancorous discussion prior to the time we got here about proposals that I don't think were ever actually proposals.
That's correct.
And I recall it started with a spreadsheet that got out in October that talked about 3 of these funding streams, and the assumption was immediately it was to the exclusion of everything else. And we're now at this one, and I know this is a scenario that was presented. It says board scenario, but the board actually never approved this, right? This is a scenario for understanding what the streams may look like.
Yeah, actually, right? we wanted to indicate that was a scenario that was shown to the board. That's all
right.
that means.
And forgive me for being super explicit, but I feel like we need to, because I've seen in the media how we've had repeated references to these as proposals and as plans. And the plan is actually something that the board's going to approve in May and June, not not now. And we're trying to get to that point and having that important conversation. And it came home to me because, I heard two very sophisticated advocates during public comment, one made reference to conflict. And to my knowledge, I don't know any board member that actually disagreed with the notion that whatever came out in October was not going to be the plan. I think there was a pretty unanimous view on that. And there was also suggestion of a reference to prior proposals and that this proposal is better. And I just really want to clearly communicate that this is part of a process. The proposals are coming. So, when I hear very sophisticated advocates telling us things like that in public comment, it tells me that we're not doing a very good job communicating. And I don't put that on you, Kathleen. I mean,
Sure, I understand.
That is all of us at the VTA. We need to more clearly communicate what we're doing here, which is we're putting proposals together. And I'm assuming you'll be offering us some options in those proposals for the 10-year vision based on what we may learn about, for example, alternatives for financing a large project like BART. Is that fair to say?
It's fair to say that it will not be, even after after the board adopts the principles and criteria, that it's going to be just one scenario that comes out. That's fair to say. Okay.
And I think you were here, but you were not. I think it was Raj's final days when I asked some questions about the financing on phase 2 in particular, and the use of TIFIA financing, and be helpful to know when we could get some clarity about the extent to which we can really take advantage of that very low cost financing to be able to move some of these numbers around, and when we might at least have some ability to do some very basic high level sensitivity analysis about how it affects our total costs and how it affects the program.
We are looking into how that would play out, and obviously the decisions at any given time about which kind of financing mechanism to be used would come up and would come back to the board. But I did hear that question last time, and we will look at in general how that would work.
Okay, great. I really appreciate Supervisor Simidian's point about the word congestion. It clearly should be in there. And I think that is a very sensible criterion to use as congestion relief. Just want to also emphasize that in addition to a congestion management agency, we're also a transit agency. And so I know those are considerations that often work together, but not always. And we should consider both as well. And I guess the last question I had was about Measure B itself, and I'm a little ashamed because I spent a lot of time working on this measure with many partners and who all pushed together. And my recollection from back in 2015 and 16 as we were putting together the program categories, and this goes really to Director Abakoga's question. I recall there being some allocation for innovative approaches. And I see I'm on the program categories list right now on the website, and I see it's not listed explicitly, and I see there's no dollar amount allocated, but I could swear we had this conversation, and Nuria in particular was quite insistent about having some amount of funding that would enable the agency to be able to probe on more innovative ways of service delivery. So I could be delusional, but I just wanted to raise the question.
Marcella, yes, Marcella, can you take that?
Okay. You are not delusional, and the board actually included that as a subcategory in transit operations.
Got it.
In fact, approved criteria. So the transit operations line up in the green section actually includes straight transit operations and a couple of sub-programs, one of which is innovative transit. And in fact, you approved as a board the criteria for that last year, and we will be bringing the results of the call for projects to you in the next month.
Okay, great. So that might be a place where Director Abikoga would go to be able to advocate for a particular innovative project.
Was that all, Sam?
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Okay. Then to Supervisor Chavez.
Thank you. And so just a few things that I would like to offer, and I'll leave it to the staff to determine whether or not these go in the overarching themes or are in the project criteria selection. One is that I think it's really important that we have a principle or a criteria around maintaining the current operation standard, the current operation levels and expansion of those levels as part of the criteria. And one of the points I wanted to raise is that I think, these ballot measures are very much in the eye of the beholder, and everyone on the call will have their own perspective about what the voters were thinking. I will say that one of the ongoing discussions that we had was really around maintaining operations. And so that is one of the things I want to make sure gets included. Second is that I think we should disaggregate equity and climate considerations, particularly because they can be both in conflict with each other. And I think that we need to better define both as we move forward. As it relates to equity, I think equity is really about whether or not we're lifting people up so there's overall fairness. And when we use equity in these discussions, it's sometimes geographic, which I think is equal and equality, versus equity, which is us recognizing that we have high need populations that need access to services. So in any case, because I do think they can be in conflict, I think they should be separate. And I also think that just given the situation we're in from the health of the earth perspective, I think it's really worth us thinking a lot about how we assess projects and programs relative to climate considerations. The other is that I wanted to weigh into something that Margaret caught my attention on, and that is relative to what community support and partner agency engagement really means. And I think that at some point there has to be kind of a deeper dive into how the staff looks at project readiness, because these are all elements of project readiness, but you do have currently internal mechanisms for determining whether or not a project is ready. And I just think it would be good for the board to understand that, and for the board to understand how project readiness is spread across a number of categories, or whether or not it's intentional to have it be in a category. Because, so just let me say period there. And then for the staff, I apologize that I can't remember who raised this. It might've been Pat. One challenge we've had on an ongoing basis is the communication that the VTA has directly with the staffs of all of our organizations, and whether or not those organizations communicate back to the members of this board from those respective jurisdictions. You may recall that as we, and Kathleen, you wouldn't, but as we were getting ready for parts of Measure B, there was a lot of disruption among the board here, that board at the time, and staffs, because you all were talking to all of our staffs, and neither party was necessarily cluing in the board member, the ones that represent those boards, to what was happening. So it wasn't VTA's fault or the city's fault, but it was kind of a combination. And I'll just raise this because as part of, when we were getting ready for Measure B, there was a lot of upset folks from the West County cities over a lack of investment in transit in the west side. And one of the points that I made was that I'd been party to a number of meetings, because I'd been on the board a long time, where what the requests we were getting from the cities were really more around roadways and road construction and that kind of thing. And you know, the city leaders were saying, no, we're for transit, but that wasn't that. We were really getting two different two different stories. So what I would just say is that I think even if it looks like a lot of communication, I think this is a time for over communication. So when there are issues that are in writing between cities and the county and everybody else, that we figure out a way to make sure that the board has that in their packets prior to a discussion about the you know, any final decisions that we make about criteria or project readiness or any of that, or what cities and counties think, cities or the county think about what investment should be made. I'm not sure the cleanest way to do that, but I just think it would benefit everybody here, especially because we have so many newer members that may not even have been regularly communicating with their transportation, public works, or whoever's doing that for their city. And then and I apologize, I waited so I could make sure that I was clear about this. I think that we have to be thinking a lot about funding and funding availability and what opportunities there are for the organization to access resources. And one of the reasons that I know we do this 2-year budget with a 10-year rolling opportunity is that, I mean, a rolling capital investment is so that the different organizations can plan and start to go look for resources, whether that's at the state or federal level. I think I'm very excited about the new administration for a number of reasons, but I think one of them is that there's going to be more opportunity, I think, for stimulus investment for construction. And I think that means that we have to be ready with projects that are ready to draw down resources as part of any stimulus package. And I don't know how we build in the agility to be applying for that, except that I appreciate we do these budgets on a 2-year rolling, which I think is important, but I think it's really important for the board to understand what's happening at a federal and state level so that we can understand better how that might impact opportunities for investment over the near term. Thank you, colleagues, for letting me chime in.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to go to Director Burt next, but I just want to go ahead and remind everybody, kind of a time check. We've got about 15 minutes yet left. I've got a couple minutes of wrap up, so we're going to go ahead and go to Director Burt next.
Thanks. Yes, I'd like to concur with what Supervisor Chavez just stated on the need to really integrate the staff recommendations with the understanding of the board. I'd also like to just mention that in addition to the potential for innovative technologies in the bucket that was mentioned, the SR 85 corridor was actually specifically identified as a candidate corridor for those innovative technologies. And that's why it was the only bucket that didn't have a defined project for, I think it was the 250 million for there when we were negotiating Measure B. And then lastly, I agree that we do need to distinguish between what we mean by social equity, which has its own set of priorities, and not just geographic equity, but really the need to leverage the dollars to upgrade the system. And the grade separations dollars that were agreed to in Measure B were intended to be leveraged to achieve separations or closures of the 8 grade crossings between Sunnyvale and Palo Alto. And they were not intended to be allocated on just a couple of those on a first come, first served basis. We've got federal dollars potentially in the pipeline and other longer term dollars over the course of that. But unless we leverage that and amongst all of those crossings, we would have a partial upgraded system. And so I just want to make sure those things are recalled from the Measure B negotiations and kept in our thinking as we go forward. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Supervisor Smidian.
Thank you for the opportunity to double dip, Mr. Chairman. A quick comment and a question. The comment is I was nodding and smiling as I was listening to Supervisor Chavez talk about how we all had, our own recollections or understandings of what the voters were thinking when we all went to the polls on Measure B. But I just wanted to underscore again, that's why I thought one of the principles should be funding allocations that are consistent with the provisions of Measure B. And I chose that word or those words, the provisions of Measure B, quite deliberately for just that reason. I think many of us will remember, and I've got the measure sitting here in front of me, it's a very long text. And then after the very long text, there is the attachment A, attachment B, attachment C, and attachment D that are very even more specific about bicycle and pedestrian candidate list and Envision Highway Program candidate list and the expressway improvements and the transit operation candidate projects and programs list. So that's precisely because that was what people voted on in black and white, and there are these varying perceptions about what motivates people. I think it would be helpful and important to just underscore that we have our marching orders and that we should be acting in a way that's consistent. The question I have is about financing, and I'm just curious if staff, and I don't know if it's Ms. Kelly or somebody else, it can help, but when we talk about financing for any of these projects, is the financing cost attributed to the project or is it off the top? And if so, pursuant to what language, direction, or decision?
I can, Evelyn, you want to go ahead?
I can take that question. Thank you. The financing cost is off the top, Director Simidian. It's located, what you will find is that the tax measure, the ballot language uses the term program tax revenues, and that's the, it's defined as the tax revenues over the life of the 30 years, including the interest on it, less any of the funds necessary for the satisfaction of debt service or the borrowing costs. Once that number, that amount is identified, it is then used to establish the allocation ratios that's in the tax measure itself.
Ms. Tran, I think rather than take up limited time today, what I'll do is, if you're amenable, I'd like to ask if you could work with my staff to identify the applicable language and its impact. I think it clearly has the potential to be relevant if we're talking about, for the sake of discussion, language that talks about $750 million for highway interchanges. If there's financing, is that number affected by the interest cost, or is that separate and apart? Same with BART, same with any of these various projects. So I think before we get farther down the path, at least for me, knowing how that affects it, particularly if we have a 25% cap on BART, but we're being asked to say, no, that's 25% plus interest. That's a different calculation of a significant order. So I'll ask my staff to work with you if that's amenable.
Yes, it is.
Thanks so much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. And then do you have something quick, Director Burt?
No, sorry, I already spoke.
Oh, okay. Well, so I'm not seeing any other hands up right now. I think this was actually a very good discussion, and I appreciate the comments. I just took a couple notes that I want to go ahead and highlight. I'm sure staff took a whole lot more than I did. But an item that came out that was very clear had to do with clarifying the timing and being very specific of what our next steps are going to be, so that people have a clear understanding of when those things are going to occur. I think we heard some information about congestion management and the provisions of Measure B and how we can clarify that into the principles and criteria of what we had. For me, I think it was kind of mentioned, but I just want to highlight the big numbers that go into whatever the ultimate slide is are the big numbers, but we need to remember that we also need to be allocating certain amount of funds for programs to help get to that readiness status, so that we can be prepared to be able to take advantage of other funding that goes on. I want to go ahead and ask staff, did you guys get the feedback you were looking for on criteria and principles?
Yes, thank you very much. We heard quite a bit, and we'll take that into account, and that's what will come back to you then in what we bring next time to actually approve these, and then use those for developing the 10-year program and the 2-year budget. It's very helpful.
Yeah, and I would just hope that as it relates to the timing of things, if maybe we can get that out early so we don't have to wait, a long time for people to be able to understand what that looks like.
Correct. Thank you.
I'm not seeing any other comments. I want to thank my colleagues for some good discussion. And again, I want to go back and I apologize to Director Rennie for cutting him off when that was inappropriate for me to do. So this was an information item. We don't need a motion because that's going to be what comes back later. I'm at item number 4, other items. I don't think we have anything here. Does anyone have any announcements? Again, I'm not seeing any. So what we're going to do now, and thank you, my colleagues, because we're actually a couple minutes early. We're going to adjourn the workshop now so we can go and continue to our special meeting. So right now I'm closing the workshop. I'm reconvening the special meeting at 11:23. We will now recess to closed session to discuss public employment. To my colleagues, the board office sent you a calendar link to get there. A friendly reminder to my fellow board members and to the public, we'll be back to the Zoom open session at the conclusion of the closed session. And at this time, I would like to ask my colleagues to mute your Zoom video and microphones and go ahead and go to your other session. Thank you all very much.
All right, this is Elaine from the board office. If you need me to resend the calendar invite, this is for the board members who are going to be joining the closed session. Please text me and I will send it to you. Thank you. And the calendar invite was for 11:30 today. Member Burt, this is Elaine from the board office. I emailed you the link and they're actually in Teams right now. I can't hear you, you're on mute. Do you want us to mute your Zoom video for now? Raise a thumbs up if you do, and we can do that. Listening. Okay.
Hello, this is Glenn. I'm sure Elaine and stuff will tell me when we've got enough people here to report back.
Yes, Chair. Let me just count. I have a quorum. Chair.
Okay, great. So this is the VTA board coming back from our closed session. We met in closed session pursuant to Government Code Section 54957, and there is nothing to report. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and I want to thank all my colleagues and the public for attending this meeting. I think we got a lot of really good information that went back to staff in the earlier session, and we almost ended exactly on time. So I want to thank everybody for participating. Session is now over. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good
Thank you,
weekend.
Glenn. Thank you, everyone.
We will end the meeting for all now.